I once did a magical ritual in Italy for a bunch of academics who will remain nameless, but whose names you've all heard. And it was wonderful to see the response afterwards. It was wonderful. But that golden thread, of course, you say you have trouble tracing it, and it's because, and who was it that I was speaking to last night? Someone had asked me about esotericism and culture and community, and what is the relationship to, like, did I grow up in an environment where cult ideas were part of the community function? And I said no, because you rarely had that. And when you look at the golden thread, what you're seeing is esoteric ideas constantly adapting themselves to the external world. Mm. And that's what makes Western esotericism unique. Because, in fact, there really is... Let me repeat that. When we look at the esoteric thread or current as it moves across the Mediterranean and into Europe, Western esotericism is constantly adapting itself to the outer world. You don't see that in Asia. So the whole notion of esotericism is really unique to the West. And of course, these are Greek words that we're using. They're not Sanskrit. They're not Chinese, they're Tibetan. They're Greek, and outer and inner. You have this outer teaching, which is the church, for which it says there is no other teaching. Now, they don't call themselves an exoteric teaching. That's how we perceive them. That's very important. Things shift around. It's a matter of our perception on those teachings. Judaism would be an example. There you had esoteric teachings. People knew about them. They knew who the rabbis were that were teaching them. You may or may not have been encouraged to go to them at different times because of the historical events that unfolded around them. But they certainly weren't hidden. It was just, okay, well, if you want to go do that, go ahead. Whereas in the dominantly Roman Catholic and then later Protestant culture of Europe, for all the great benefits that it brought to Europe, at the same time, one of the downsides was that sometime after and really it's after the 10th century, when you see Christianity moving throughout Europe and Northern Europe in particular, up until, say, the 6th through 10th century, 4th through 10th century, you can get away with anything as long as you put in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost after it. Which is great, because that's what we're going to be doing this afternoon. But as things change, as things codify and get more rigid, you see these breakings up of schools and saying, no, this is the way it is. No, this is the way it is. We see that's duality. They're not looking at things progressively. It's like being a Quaker is wonderful, but after a while everyone just falls asleep or gets moved to say something that no one else really cares about because they can't handle the silence anymore. But that originally the notion of that inward reflection of peace is wonderful. That's missing in a lot of churches. The great ritual liturgy of the Roman Catholic Church or some of its Protestant offshoots, such as the Anglican Church or the Lutheran Church. These are wonderful liturgies that elevate you. You feel specialness, particularly the use of saints. That one is like me. I can identify with it. The chain. There's a reason within Catholic Europe, that the saints had greater call at times as local deities, than really the main church itself. And Agrippa says, this, prayers to the saints are very powerful because they are like us and hear our calls. And maybe that's not necessarily true, But it shows an understanding of this idea of abstraction and distance that many people actually feel with the church, or church's teachings. Because those higher teachings are too abstract for day-to-day life. That's where we get into these navel gazers who just can't connect to reality. And you know them, we call them, you used to call them the New Age bliss bunnies and all that stuff. Terra firma. Put the feet on the ground. You don't see that kind of stuff in Jewish mysticism. Jewish mysticism has strong warnings about that kind of thing because it was part of the culture. It may, again, at different times and places, it was not supported, but people knew it existed. It didn't go away. It wasn't pushed out, except by historical social pressures rather than theological. In the East, everyone, being a yogi was the one way you could free yourself from the caste system. You were then free. In China, in Tibet, and I'm sure other places as well that I'm unfamiliar with, temple worship, daily worship. You want to study as a lama, fine. Lamas are traveling, fine. You want to go to the Hermitage, fine. You want to go study with the yogi, fine. These guys are all traveling. They all knew where they were. If they didn't know where they were, they knew how to get a hold of them. I'll go talk to this one, go talk to that one. So the relationship was there. It wasn't hidden. They may have hid themselves because they didn't want to be bothered, but it was not hidden. And that's the difference in Western esotericism becomes occultism or hidden for its own survival. Unfortunately, in the modern era, many people like to keep it hidden as a sense as if they're protecting the teachings. They're not. The teachings don't need to be protected. They're self-protected. To this, I like to quote His Holiness Dudjom Rinpoche, the head of the Nyingma order, when it was first in exile. And he said, all these teachings are self-protected. He says, because either you can do it or you can't. And either you have the wherewithal to learn how to do it or you don't. But we don't need to protect them. We just need to preserve them and transmit them. And the same thing in Western esotericism, we saw this whole notion of protection in the 20th century, particularly in the last 30 years. Not so much now, but from, say, the 80s to the 90s into around 2000, where a lot of folks said, we got to protect this. We can't. What you're doing is you're protecting your own ignorance. You're protecting people, protecting your own ignorance from people knowing that you really don't know as much as you think you do. Because what had happened is means of transmission built up. And this golden thread was one of small informal groups.
Right.
Think about that. Small informal groups, smaller than this, would meet. They trade books, they copy them by hand, they talk about what they did, they write things down, and pass it on to another generation or to someone else. And this is how it kept moving alive. And then small groups might form more informally, such as John Dee's The School of the Night, where these people would get together to talk about things. And it wasn't just what we think of as occultism. It covered that whole area of first book of natural magic, what we consider science, mathematics as well. We move forward. And it's the early part of the 18th century. And in the 18th century, you have Freemasonry becoming a more present force. And then you have the formation of the First Grand Lodge, meaning several lodges got together and recognized the authority of a superior administrative body over them, so that they get a uniform practice. For reasons not sure, Masonry takes off. And within 30 years, you have all of these lodges in Europe I mean, they existed, but they're having all these rituals and these rites. And by the middle of the 18th century, you have this full-blown thing we call Scottish Rite that, Dan Moran talks about a lot in the last book,
So is Freemasonry more formula-based or principle-based?
Let me get to that.
Okay.
Well, what happened at this time is Masonry is a very symbolic organization that went from being operative stonemasons to using the symbols of operative stonemasonry in a philosophical sense, and they became speculative masons. But they had to have something, because why would these rich guys want to sit and lodge with these, stonemasons if they didn't know something? But what they knew was most likely geometry. It's probably no more sophisticated than that. But what is geometry? Is the queen of the sciences. Without it, nothing happens. And all of this is because of geometry. Okay. So it's very important. They knew math. And there was a time when math was considered an occult art that you couldn't study. So they knew math, they knew algebra, they knew geometry. They could read and write. Think about that. That's a lot. They traveled freely from country to country and met with other people. So this became an organization that many believe was kind of co-opted by secret societies. And I think to some degree it's true, but in an informal way. I don't think it was a big conspiratorial thing. It's because, hey, here's an opportunity. Here's a conduit. Let's use it. So by the middle of the 18th century, you have these Masonic rites, which are incredibly hermetic, chivalric, esoteric, alchemical, just popping up like mushrooms all over France and Germany, to some degree England. For some reason, they didn't take on to the appended rites as much, but just all over the place. And why is that? Because people wanted secret knowledge, and just like then, every seller of a secret, there's a buyer. We know that too well, don't we?
We're here.
But I'm not selling you snake oil.
Just a joke.
But that's the point. You've all been through the mill. And you're better off for it, right? But you still get tempted back every now and then. That's okay. And with that, a lot of groups came up. And different societies, secret societies, would form as a side group, and they'd use, and not just masonry, but other structures, other social settings, to say, oh, you know what, you know something. That's interesting. You have an interest. How about, you might want to talk to this person here, or you might want to talk to this one. So it becomes a recruiting ground. And sometimes that recruiting ground is very open, such as when Pasquales does his order of the El Kohen, or the elect Kohen, the elect priests. Very popular. And the El Kohen under Pasquales, who was a semi-literate Portuguese Jew using a phony Masonic warrant from the Stuarts to establish his quasi-Masonic magical body in France in the 1850s, he was just this dynamic guy. He didn't speak French well, but he'd get these aristocrats around him because he had a magical system, an operative system, and it was very detailed and difficult. Rituals would last for maybe 6 or 7 hours. But much of it was very devotional, and it was very Roman Catholic. And that surprises a lot of students today when they read it. They're surprised. Why is this so Roman Catholic? You're in the 18th century. What else is it going to be? Okay, and that's neither right nor wrong. It's just the model of expression that he used, because the rituals he used were often from the earlier grimoires, the Solomonic text. There are variations of those. His lodges were very in the open, but when they collapsed, the degrees got absorbed into the higher degrees of Scottish Rite. And that doesn't mean that Scottish Rite Masons know that they have the operative methods of the El Kohen in, I don't know which degree it is, 25th or 8th or something. No, they don't. But the seeds of it are there, the pieces of it, like a file waiting to be opened on a computer. So that's what each of those degrees began to represent, little files that could be opened. And you had these side orders that then would be fully expressed on their own. Well, we no longer just recruit Masons. We are open to everyone. Or fill in the blank, whatever it is. Well, these orders ebb and flow. They come and go. Sometimes the tradition is down to a few people. When the Martinist order was established in Paris in the late 19th century, there were two people, and what they had was hardly a tradition. They had a few symbols that they had inherited. They had some words, some vague means of recognition, and they recognized each other as having come from this distant lineage. Other times it's more complete. It's more whole. Some of those traditions came to the United States, of course, during the late 17th century, when Johannes Kelpius went to Owaissa in Fairmount Park, which at that point was wilderness. And if I understand correctly, a lot of people avoided it because of the rattlesnakes. And there he and a bunch of hermits, known as calling themselves the Women in the Wilderness, after the Book of Revelations, contemplated a lot of theosophical, feminist, the teachings of Jacob Boehme and others, and Kabbalah and alchemy, and spent their time waiting for the second coming. A fellow would follow after him, known as Conrad Weisel. Weisel, of course, would arrive too late. Kelpius would be dead. Weisel would make his way to Ephrata and establish the Ephrata community there, which would evolve and change over time. It would have lay members who were married and had families who would come. It had celibate male and celibate female. The Brotherhood of Zion and the Sisterhood of the Rose of Sharon. Even within there, you would have people rise up who would have kind of an almost saintly nature. Kelpius, or Weisel himself, was profoundly charismatic. He had just despite his frail, sickly appearance, the chicks couldn't get enough of him.
Is that Rasputin?
No, because you see, Rasputin at least indulged. I think for Conrad, it was just kind of seeping up through his pores. So, that might have been part of the attraction, the unattainable. You know how that works for all of us. But he was a profoundly charismatic person. He was profoundly visionary. And his descriptions of his visions, if you know how to read the language, are just like out-of-body experiences that would last for days. And then he'd come back and he would tell what he had seen. Not unlike Hildegard von Bingen. They thought she was dead many times when she'd wake up. Glad they didn't start doing the embalming process. But, that charisma was his magia, his magic. Okay. Well, he went off at one point because things were going wrong, and he went to see one of the last survivors of the Kelpius community, who was a hermit known as Matthias. I think it was Conrad Matthias, and Matatai. And Conrad is kind of looked upon by some as a saint of great magical renown that is sometimes used as a focal point of aspiration in some powwow circles. And what powwow is a word we don't know the origin or meaning of. But on practice, it is the survival of medieval and Renaissance magic, particularly Northern Hermeticism or German magic, in the colonial period to the present. And it is very different, of course, from what many of you would have encountered. Now, that said, within the traditional structures of, say, the Elo Kahain, a very formal ritualized magical order, within the written text of Agrippa, within the very informal and fragmented teachings that exist in different circles in Pennsylvania German community, or what's left of it, parts of Ohio, streaming down into Kentucky and West Virginia and Kentucky, which really those influences are not Scotch and Irish. They are actually traceable to the earlier German lineages that moved through, down into Carolinas, and even further south into New Orleans, affecting, even moving into hoodoo. We see several key things always occurring. So between these very diverse and divergent streams of practice, from simple old ladies healing warts to magicians drawing circles on the floor for rituals that last 6 hours at a pop, invoking all sorts of angelic beings, we see 4 common texts being used. These 4 biblical books play a critical role in Western magical practices. The book of Genesis, the Psalms, the Gospel of John, the Revelation of John, or the Apocalypse. You will note that Agrippa says, when creating your magic book, the first thing you must do is you must draw upon the first page the symbol of one of the scenes from the book of Revelation of John, and on the last page you must draw a scene from the Revelation of John. First page is Jesus with the sword in the mouth. The last page is the lamb upon the book of the 7 seals. So these 4 books are critical. Okay? You've got to grasp that. It is often stated the wages of sin are death. And the reason Genesis is important is because it provides us with the origins and the fall of man. In Christian tradition, suffering, sickness, and death are the result of sin. Sin, be it the original sin, or what we call the fall from grace. The grace is what the Edenic state, the state of perfection. This in many ways can be looked upon as the Golden Age. We've talked about the 4 ages: Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and now the Age of Iron, what the Hindus call, and of course the Tibetan Vajrayana, the Kali Yuga, the age of suffering and death. Okay, these 4 ages are what they use as the progression of society, of humanity, and they're cyclic; they're constantly recurring. Okay, that means the key point is creation is an ongoing state. It's not a simple one-point deal. It happens. It's continual. This is very difficult to grasp. So we fall from grace, and salvation, of course. Fall from grace means fall from, of course, we can think of it as that unitative state, non-duality. The fall is into duality, either or. And of course, one of the things I'd recommend to you, because we may not have time to go over it, is it's really important that you understand some of the writings of Rabbi Isaac Luria. Because Lurianic Kabbalah forms at least in many ways, the core parts of Western magic. And his book, Windows of the Soul, is one that's readable. And he talks a lot about this in the book. Here creation there's four attempts at creation. It's not just it doesn't happen. It's, that tried and it didn't quite work. That tried, okay, it didn't quite work worse. So it's interesting, again, the number 4, these 4 phases, until we finally get to where we're at now. And of course, it's considered really a poor imitation of the first effort. Kind of like that photocopy that everyone just keeps photocopying. So sin, of course, is what? To miss the point. It's to be in error. The error is where? Where does the error take place? In the mind. That's right. It's the only place it can take place. That's very important to know. So suffering, sickness, and death are the result of sin. They're a result of the error of the mind, the error of our thinking, and then the actions that follow forth from it. So when we accept Christ into our lives, after the second coming, the faithful, the dead will be resurrected. Suffering and sickness and death will be no more. Depends on who you ask. No, really. I mean, the outer notion is that there's some kind of eternal physical life on Earth in this golden state. See, because, of course, they're looking at it as static. Everything's linear, not cyclic. But if you look at it from a different view, what we're talking about is your illumination. Duality is no longer an issue for you. Okay? We call that enlightenment or salvation. So that then means that death is no more, because there can be no more error. If you understand cause and effect, or the effects of your actions, then you not only wouldn't, but why would you? You couldn't do anything that would be harmful to you. So that means there's no more illness, there's no more suffering, there's no more death, because you're filled with light. You are awake. Remember, the awakening of the dead, the resurrection of the dead. They talk about Mary as being asleep, and we go to sleep in the ward, asleep to be awakened.
Then spirituality does become an individual.
Yeah, it always is. It's always individual, because no one can do the work for you. But we help each other. We learn from one another. We speed up the learning curve. You know? And by creating environments that are conducive to it, we speed up the learning curve.
For us too.
That's exactly it. You understand? Really, it's in my best interest. If you want to be,
there's less negativity being bounced off you.
Exactly. If you want to be selfish about it, it's in my best interest
To
help. Yeah. And to put it in the most selfish terms, it's still in your best interest. So if it's interesting to view this, because Gnosticism, as well as some schools of, I think all of Vajrayana Buddhism, they really see material life as an error. Material life is an error because it's a mistake is made. You're not in that archetypal purity. Okay. But at the same time, we can find within material life that archetypal purity. That's one of the differences of different schools. Some want to escape from physical life and say, I just want to go to the transcendent. Others say, it's above, so below. It's right here. I find it right here at this time, not at some future date. Okay.
That explains why the food is so lousy in the monastery.
That's right. Well, I guess it depends on what kitchen you get from. Now, when we look at Genesis, we see several key areas for discussion. Creation of the cosmos, the creation of man and woman, the naming of the animals, and the fall from grace and original sin. Now, the creation of the cosmos is out of nothingness, or the negative limited light of Kabbalah. This is the Ein Sof, the Ein Sof are, the negative limitless light. This is a great void. I like Isaac Luria because he spends a great deal of time talking about the Ein Sof. One of the errors we make in modern Kabbalah is we talk almost exclusively about Keter. Okay, but you're still dealing at that point with what we call first cause, or in Gnostic terms, a demiurge. What we really want to look at is the void. Okay.
Is that when you do the Kabbalah cross, isn't that what you're supposed to connect to?
Yeah, but you are, but really, Keter is really supposed to be connecting to really the void. But if you look closely at the way a lot of the teachings are given, you're not. You're not really. You're connecting with something right on the edge of it. Yeah. So you have to open it up more. You just have to push the boundary of it more. And that'll suffice. It's because it's a notion. It's all just a notion. If you really could connect with it, then please take the seat, And I mean that seriously. We talk about these things in ways as if they're incredibly concrete. As if it's very simple. It's not. It's a progressive process, and all that progressive process is all within us. Man is an expression of this all. Okay, Adam, the first man. Okay, of this all-encompassing power. It is, but it was created in part by the secondary causes, or the Elohim. This is where we see, let us create man in our own image. These Elohim, or secondary causes, okay, are forces of nature. Okay, so we could say that the forces of nature bring things into being, brings awareness into being. That maybe consciousness isn't or wasn't such a idea like, hey, we're going to make this, but these forces just through their interactions give rise to something. This is one of the possibilities of it. The other is that we have within us all of these other forces, which we would call like the planetary forces, the elemental forces. And these in part can be represented by the Elohim as an arching banner. It's interesting because this power is expressed in two forms. Okay? In one of the creation stories, because there's two of them in Genesis, Adam is originally kind of bisexual in nature because woman is taken out of him, or Eve. When we talk about Eve, esoterically, we're talking about, of course, creation, expressed creation, duality in the world of form that we can identify with, form-giving things. In another part, Eve is then created and presented to Adam. Regardless of this is a golden age. This is an archetypal world that we're talking about, not something literal. Now, in the Garden of Eden, there are many trees. Some say 10. In the middle of them is the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Our work is often with the tree of life, particularly Gloria's tree of life, his version of it. And upon eating of which tree? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they saw that they were naked, and they were ashamed and hid from God. This simply means that in Eden, their original state, they're kind of in a primordial bliss. There's no sense of duality. There's no sense of otherness. And whatever thoughts arose of attraction and repulsion, which is the core forces in our being, fight or flight, attraction, repulsion, want, don't want. Those are prime motivators. Okay? Those things which first rose up created shame. Meaning, feeling of ego, feeling of inadequacy. This is the beginning of neurotic thought. Okay? You understand?
Yeah.
Okay. We would say that, in the primordial state, that the fall was a willful thing. This is another story. And it works as well. Is that, out of primordial bliss was this ignorance, and only in order to know, to become self-aware, we have to have separation, or that sense of separation. So in Western esotericism, in Kabbalah and magic, we look at the fall in two ways. One is, again, as kind of this error in which we're trying to reintegrate into this primordial archetypal unity, hence we call the path of return. We call the fruits of the path of return reintegration into the whole. But also we look at it as a willful decision, like the prodigal son who leaves and then comes back, because then he'll have something to offer. And we come down, we come in ignorance. And you see this notion of the fall and the return, involution and evolution at different schools constantly taking place. Which is nice, because that means our wretched state is not only temporary, but it's also something that we can get a purpose from. And that purpose is what? To become self-aware. Again, going back to Alice Levy's statement, the purpose of the great work is for each person to fully express and manifest the powers within and of themselves. What are those powers? The powers which we call the kingdom of heaven, the archetypal purity, which exists where? Within. And we have to pull that out. We have to uncover that. Okay? See, the archetypal bliss has no room for duality. That's why we talked about earlier when you're doing the meditation, focusing on this joy, this happiness. Because with that, there's no room for duality. There's no room for separation. And while in the beginning it's going to be artificial for you, and it's going to be contrived, and you say, well, I'm faking it. Well, that's all right. That's all we do in life. Whether you fake it till you make it, as they say in recovery circles, or whether you keep, doing assumption of the God form till it might work. You just keep habituating yourself to the ideas and the notions that you want, and the feelings that go with them, and they will grow over time. Now, to be careful here, because as I said, it's easy to slip into a kind of dualism here, where the material world is meant to be shunned. And we see that in some teachings, and it's not. It's part of the practice, and particularly in this, what we would call the age of iron, the age of the wolf, the age of the Kali Yuga. The material world is our jumping off pad. It's part of the process. In the 18th century school of the Elocohen of Pasqualis, the fall of Adam was seen as similar to the murder of Osiris, in which Adam fell to pieces. And these pieces each contained a divine spark and makes up all the members of humanity, of which it is their task to reintegrate it into the whole. And that's interesting because also one of the divine sparks that fall, what do they create before that is they create the clip-off of the shells, which become what we call the demonic forces. These negative forces slither upon the earth, represented by the serpent in the Garden of Eden, but they are not to be abandoned but pulled forth with us, as our earlier prayers mentioned, because they contain a spark of the divine as well. And it is in their salvation within us, our own, again, these would be our neurotic tendencies, our own self-limiting notions, our own negative feelings towards ourselves and others. By overcoming these, we accomplish our work, our assistance to others, and at the same time have a effect that reaches beyond our mere mind into the actual material world itself. Because at that point, the notion of separation has been radically thinned. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
By integrating and overcoming our own neurotic tendencies, which we see as the demonic forces, okay? And by pulling them within us and integrating them, we recognize that divine spark that is everywhere, doing that repair of the early work, okay?
So it's accepting your dark side.
But transforming it into light, and realizing that there is no light and dark side. See, within Lurianic Kabbalah, very similar to the writings of Jacob Buma, there is the blissful loving God, and there is a severe God, but they're both God. What do? We see what we've done is we tend to think of spirituality as always being nice. And it's true, we have to be kind to one another and generous, and I do not wish to offend you or anyone here. But sometimes when people ask questions, if you really want the answer, then we have to be careful. You really want the answer, or an answer that will help you. And if you just simply want me to reinforce your own neurotic thinking, then that's not helping you. So there's going to be an abrasive period where I don't like that. I don't like you. You said something bad to me. You're supposed to approve of me and love me as I am. Don't be so judgmental. That's not spiritual. Hey, get over it. It's like how you treat others is important. But treating others means do unto others as you would have others do unto you. So I don't want people to simply, if I'm walking, if I'm lie to me, it's like the king has no clothes. If I'm walking around in my underwear, tell me. And, thanks, appreciate it. I left the Marvel boxers at home.
What is this neurotic force, and how is it connected to, say, primordial instincts, biological, genetically passed on traits we have from our ancestors?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, because you see this separation of material and physical is very difficult on this level. There's a lot of overlap. So the conditioning takes place often in the nervous system. So those of you who do body therapies and yoga know that these emotions somatize in the body. That's why we say, forgive me, I have sinned in thought, word, and deed. Remember we talked about it, sinned in thought, word, and deed. I've made mistakes in my thoughts, in my speech, and in my actions. Well, of course, then what's the way of, then don't sin in thought, word, and deed. So our thoughts, our words, and our actions become the tools for integration. As expressed, say, in ritual work, we do certain things, we say certain prayers, we think certain ideas, and it all begins in the mind. So the mind has ideas, and when they hold on to them powerfully, they become emotionalized, and those emotions then create, tensions in the body. Those tensions in the body, it's believed, but now here's an esoteric, please understand this is purely esoteric, actually make a marker imprint in the psychic body. That images are actually held there. I think this is true to some degree. And that this is transmitted on from generation to generation. Because at the same time, that's why they talk about the seventh generation. Because we change our physical structure through, and this is getting beyond the scope right now, but we do change our physical structure as a result of these practices. It has an effect on them. And to think that's limited to me is not true. It's passed on to my children. So it has an opportunity for them. It doesn't necessarily guarantee certain things, but it has an opportunity.
Do they serve any purpose, though? Do you think they serve or have in the past served a purpose? Was beneficial?
Oh, sure. That's the big thing. Everything we do has a purpose. We talked about that last time about values. Values are what we get rewarded for. That's how we form them, what we get rewarded for. So what was valuable in one setting may not be valuable in another, but if we're habituated unconsciously doing the same thing, then we run into problems.
Expecting it to be valued, and it's...
Yeah, and it's not. And that's what, and I don't like to use, this is an easy example. There are many which are more subtle, and I'll try to think of one. But you see, post-traumatic stress disorder. You see these veterans who are exposed to powerful emotional situations, and powerful emotional situations are what cause the psychic knot. That's it. That's what causes the imprint on the mind and on the body. So they're exposed to this, and then they're rewarded for certain behaviors when that takes place. But there's external stimuli that bring it into motion. There's external stimuli or sounds, phoneme, that cause that emotional trigger. There's external visual things that cause it. I forget the name of the author, but he was a British soldier during the First World War, and he wrote a book called Goodbye to All That. And he talked about going home on leave from Belgium in 1915 or 1916 or whatever it was. And he said, he couldn't relax, he couldn't enjoy leave, because when he's walking through the countryside, he's saying, oh, that'd be a nice place for a machine gun. Because that's what's been imprinted on it. And he knows this, he recognizes this, and that's why you end up with the lost generation.
That was valued in a certain situation. Survival.
Excellent. That's the point. It's survival.
Absolutely.
See, we don't exist in a survival situation anymore. So we really don't understand the way a large part of the world was and still is.
Yeah.
And that's very important, because what you need to do under one situation is not necessarily what you need to do in another. And what we're looking at is trying to find some kind of mechanism where we can not simply be acting habituated to situations, okay, but begin to perceive a larger picture of truth that allows us to then say, well, this is the right action for this situation. And this is the right action that will allow either the most benefit for everyone or the least harm, rather than just stimuli response, stimuli response, stimuli response. And that's where the original fall is, as it's described in the one way. It's simply a stimuli response mechanism. And now, stimuli response allows us to think, there might be more to this. There might be more to this. Okay?
It's the truth.
I'm going to go take a nap. Wake up, fall asleep. Wake up, fall asleep. But it's still stimuli response. You really only dedicate yourself truly to spiritual practices when you think there's a payoff. The payoff was, I want to learn magic so I can get stuff. Because my life sucks and I really want to change things. Stimuli response. Okay, that's kind of working well, but not as well as I thought. So how about, and then it goes from there. And it goes from very narrow to very wide. Originally it was very wide to very narrow. Now it's very narrow to very wide. Or broader, if you will. Okay. So now we also have the Psalms. The Psalms, or the Songs of David, are the most commonly used part of the Old Testament for esoteric work. The one you heard at the beginning was the 91st Psalm, and that, of course, is always said prior to magical operations. You can learn them, sing them in Latin if you like, do it in Hebrew, I don't really care, do them in whatever language you like. The Psalms also have divine names that are associated with them as well, and you find that in, I think, the fourth appendix of the 6th and 7th books of Moses. You have the Gospel of John. This is the most esoteric of all the Gospels. It is not a synoptic Gospel, meaning that if you take Matthew, Mark, and Luke and you line them up, even though Mark is the smallest Gospel, and I believe Matthew is the longest, you see roughly a similar pattern of the story developing. The Gospel of John is different. This is where it is in the beginning was the Word, or as we say, in principe erat verbum, in the beginning was the Word. And there's much discussion about what that word actually might have meant. Okay? But this is the most esoteric. You find that it is often, during various initiations, those that use a Bible, it is often open to that gospel. And again, some organizations will do their openings, and this is important. We say in the name of, meaning in the power, in the creative essence. That's what we say by name. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, in the name of the Holy Trinity, or sometimes you'll see it also, some groups will do in the name of St. John.
Why do you think it's different? It's just connected differently?
What is John?
Yeah,
it's more esoteric. It also, there's some references in it that had occurred prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. So earlier readers were saying they didn't know. They didn't know, so they weren't sure about it. And they kind of hung out on the fringes for a long time. Then there's the book of Revelations. This is the most difficult book of the New Testament in that it is completely symbolic and has several levels of meaning. These levels include a historical meaning relevant to the early period of Christianity. Many people say that the book of Revelations deals with the early Christian experience. Okay. You have a second interpretation which says this is a prophecy of events to occur in the future at the end of the Christian era. But within that context, it also means history as we know it. Because again, the idea is a linear motion rather than a cyclic one. Esoterically, we think cyclically, it's just the end of the era. And of course, in the gospel, it talks about the end of the age, not the end of the world. The end of the age, the end of the era. Okay? Which is where we're at. John Dubuis had stated that it was a text of Christian initiation on an interior level, which we'll talk about, and sort of a guidebook for the souls of the dead within the Christian context, which I think is partially true. Any effort to attempt to interpret the book of Revelations in a singular way will be false.
What was the fourth one? The guidebook of what?
Kind of a book of the dead.
A book of the dead, thank you.
Now, it's very important to understand that your understanding of the gospel of, the Revelation of St. John is formed by a uniquely not only Western church perspective, but Western Protestant perspective. Even Kelpius thought that the second coming was at hand. And if you had survived the 30 Years' War, or had been descendants of those who had survived the 30 Years' War, you probably would too. Again, those experiences shaped and formed the philosophy and the spirituality of a people. And the closest example I can give you is this. It took 200 years for Central Europe, and Germany, to get back the same level of infrastructure it had in 1615. 200 years. Okay? Think of this. You have massive movements of people across the countryside. You have foreign armies traipsing across the place for 30 years off and on. You have no gold. You have no silver. And you're down to what's called the copper standard. So if you have some copper, that's the only precious metal of value outside of steel. Okay? That's the level of suffering that all of Central Europe experienced for almost 2 generations, 30 years at that time. And that had a profound effect on what they thought was happening. This is so horrible, of course. Of course, Jesus had to be coming back. This is what was described. How can it be worse than this? Could. Honestly, could. It didn't happen. Those views fall. Come and go, come and go. But the notion or the hope of it is embedded in it. And Jacob Bimo always talked about the time in the lily, that future time when everything would be made right. The time of the lily. Everything would be brought back to primordial harmony. They were kept open for it. Now, within the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and this is important to note, the Revelation of John is viewed as a book that is never read during the liturgy. It's viewed as a liturgical text. So this Revelation of John is not a historical event. Their interpretation is very mystical, very esoteric. It's not a historical event that will take place at some time in the future, that has taken place at some time in the past, but is currently happening right now. Again, going back to Du Bois' the idea that it's an initiatic text. That's why you see a lot of, at least in the French esotericism, a lot of the moderns are quasi-Orthodox, even if they're Roman Catholic, they're quasi-Orthodox in their orientation. Okay. So that is really the way it needs to be read. This is an unfolding pattern right now, in which I am the actor. So let us look at the words so we know that, right? Jesus Christ is the source of salvation. Jesus Christ is who? That is the descent of the Godhead into matter that comes to redeem humanity. That is a spiritual force fully present, uncorrupted, meaning it has no neurotic tendencies, if you want to call it that. Okay? No scoria. Nothing was corrupted in the fall, as you see like in the Gnostic texts where Sophia is mangled and raped along the way until she's barely recognizable in the end and then works her way back up. No. This is a descent full and complete. The light is expressed fully and completely to all beings. It brings light, therefore illumination. The illumination continues to grow and spread. With that light, again, we overcome our notions of I and thou. Like the Lord's Prayer is, there's no I in it. There's no I in it. You're praying for everyone when you pray. Okay? And then with that, you get salvation, which is what we say, the return to unity, that primordial awareness. I don't like the word unity, but that's the one we find most often used. But it's a primordial, a pure awareness, where those mental errors no longer exist. We've cleansed them. Now, of course, we say what? The Christ is what? Jesus Christ, we can look at him as a historical person, which is essential for much of the magic, but at the same time is a force, an archetypal force. And of course, again and again, what do we see reference to? Christ within. And that's very important because in the magic that we'll talk about this afternoon, it's always about these things which I have done, so shall you do, which you see in the gospel. People call on the name of Jesus Christ within the context of the Bible. They call on John within the context of the Bible. They call on the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost within the context of the Scriptures. With Moses, let's say, as Moses has done this, as Solomon has done this, as David has done this, so do I do. And that's in its own way kind of an assumption of the God form. Mm-hmm. You know, they have done it through this power, I can do it as well. Do you understand? Mm-hmm. This is very important. This has been done. This is being done. And this will be done in the future. Mm-hmm. This has been done. This is being done. And this will be done. This was not a one-time event. That all of this is within me too. So all of these self-limiting feelings, all of these feelings of inadequacy, all of these pity parties that go on, these are not present. Yeah. So this way, God is the source of all. The Son is our inner direct nature of perception. And the Holy Spirit, or Shekinah, is the creative life energies that permeate the visible and invisible realms. But remember, it's to dwell in the immanent presence of deity, right here, right now.
Can you repeat those?
The Father is the source of all being. It is the everything, all. The Son is our direct perception of reality, of actuality. We use two terms, reality and actuality. You've heard the terms relative and absolute. Relative is, from my perception, absolute is what is. I was brought up with the terms reality and actuality. Actuality is what is. Reality is relative to one's perception. Okay, so that would be duality versus the picture. The joke being that, when there's first of all, there's no such thing as an automobile accident in the police report. There's automobile collisions. So those of you who understand the difference get it. The reason being is that, whenever you have a collision, you have two parties and some witnesses, and whatever number that adds up to, that's how many different stories you have. Yeah. That would be reality. Now, one of those people standing on the street corner might actually have seen the whole thing, and they can tell you what actually happened. Okay? So actuality is what's actually going on, uncorrupted, unobscured.
That's the Son.
Okay? And that's the Son. That's the Christ, and that is direct perception. Because on the tree of life, we give that to Tiferet, and that is united to all the spheres. And that's the heart. The heart-mind. That's why we have to open the heart-mind and expand it. Okay? And of course, the Holy Spirit is often called the female presence, the feminine presence of deity, the immanent presence of God. That's the initiatic power, if you want to know. That's why you'll see in most of the initiations in the classical world, women are given as the initiatic force. Pleasantly dressed in red, if dressed at all.